Well, for more on this, we're joined now by Marco Vicenzino, who is a global strategy advisor. He joins us from New York. Thank you very much for being with us once again here on Al Jazeera. Before we get to the diplomacy and security side of things, understand that Russia's spy service has said the US and British are basically trying to push its forces out from its military bases in Syria. Is there any surprise that the US and the UK are using this as a way to try and get Russia out of the country?
Basically, this is part of a wider diplomatic game. All sides engage in forms of propaganda. The key thing is presenting evidence. But I think, yes, from a broad diplomatic geopolitical perspective, of course, the Americans, the UK, and other powers would want the Russian to exit it. The key thing is that the Russians have been identified with the Assad regime for decades. So the pressure upon them to exit the country is enormous, not just from the foreign powers, but internally also. Particularly, you look at ordinary people in the country, what they've suffered under Russian air power starting largely in 2015 onwards. So this is what they're saying is part of a broader propaganda game. Deep down inside, the Russians, what they want most is to try to retain a presence in Syria as much as possible. Its key bases, it has the naval base outside the port city of Latakia, and the Air Force base is outside the port city of Latakia, and then the naval base is in Tartus. Strategically, very, very important. It also serves as a conduit to its growing Russian operations in Africa, and these are bases that they've had since the early 70s, and this infrastructure there is enormous. And it's difficult to replicate such a base in such a short amount of time in any other part of the Mediterranean or Africa.
OK, so they're desperate to hold on to those. Sorry, Marco, they're desperate to hold on to those bases. I mean, but are they going to be able to, considering the huge amount of pressure, like you say, that is coming from the US and the UK and many others in the region, but also from within the country now with this new Syrian administration?
You have to divide it on two sides here. You have the economic, diplomatic side and the internal political. The government right now in Syria needs, the HTS-led government in Damascus, needs funds. It needs to be removed from the terrorism list international for many countries, and it also needs for the sanctions on Syria to be lifted. This will unleash funds and financing. So on the one hand, when it comes down to many countries, but particularly Russia, the current government is saying, what are you willing to offer us economically and diplomatically? The government is quite pragmatic in that sense. But the key thing is that even if they cut a deal, any form of deal, they have to be able to sustain that internally in the country. And to sustain that politically and to continue justify a continuing Russian presence in the country, it's not easily to justify because you had so many people at the base within the HTS and several other opposition movements. Their political bases will react and will react very fiercely. So once again, although economically and diplomatically they may want to engage them, politically it will be highly unsustainable from a domestic political perspective.
OK, there's obviously so many different factions and so many different countries all pushing and pulling against one another. I mean, is all of this just going to destabilise the country even further than we've seen?
It depends on how the current leadership in Damascus handles it. It has to do so, it has to manage it effectively. It has to deal with internal domestic factors to retain some form of normalcy, order, and security on the ground. But at the same time, it has to deal with competing interests from external powers. Generally speaking, most external powers, yes, they do have a vested interest in some form of stability in Syria because the fear of spillover into their countries, particularly issues of security and terrorism. So you see all these various delegations from the Western powers from throughout the region in recent days and weeks since December 7th have visited. They're all coming to try to engage this current government to see, but the current government is asking them, what are your terms and conditions to engage us? And what they're looking for is some form of support, economically, diplomatically. So this is a game, not just internal, but external also. And in addition to that, there are parts of the country in the east and the northeast that the government doesn't actually control. So it has to engage in a longer-term geopolitical diplomatic game with other powers in the region, particularly in the Northeast. You're looking at the one side being U.S.-backed, one back being Syrian-backed. One side being Turkish-backed. And then you have the long borders with Iraq. They have their interests. Their intelligence chief came in recent days. Lebanon, Israel, Jordan. This is a very complex game. We can go on for hours here discussing the details, what the various interests are. But the bottom line is the government has to walk a very fine line to maintain order and security domestically and to be able to engage in this diplomatic game with outsiders, to be able to get its interests and to maximize its interests as much as possible. It's in a very weak position diplomatically and economically.
Yeah, like you say, extremely complex, but also very delicate at the same time. Thanks so much, Marco. Marco Vicenzino, Global Strategy Advisor. Thank you.
Thank you.